some folks who are joining. We still have some folks who are joining, but the meeting is being recorded, and so anyone who joins late can catch up. Anyone who's joining for the first time can visit our website and catch up with prior recordings. We'll continue to do these once a month until we work our way through the confessions. I'd like to thank again Kevin for all of his preparation and then ultimately moderation of these discussions. We've been getting great feedback, so please feel free to share this with people in your network, whether they be consider themselves to be Augustinians or not. And so with that, what I'd like to do is begin with a short prayer, and then I will put myself on mute and turn it over to Kevin to lead the rest of the discussion this evening. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I am, and the Holy Spirit. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. St. Augustine, please pray for us, and please pray for me, because I surely need it. With that, Kevin, please take it away and save me from any further embarrassment.
Okay, happy to jump in. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome back, everybody. We are in books 2 and 3 of Confessions. So let's go ahead and jump into books 2 and 3. But let's start by making a connection back to book 1. Most of book 1, as you probably remember if you read through it, was Augustine describing the first 2 of the 3 stages of a classical education. This is what's framing what's going on in book 1. This program of education is really well attested from antiquity. Some of the best firsthand descriptions we have of it come from Augustine, come from book 1 of Confessions, as well as books 2 and 3. So since the theme of education concerns all of the books, let's frame this in a little bit. We're going to do this through a visual that I'm going to share with everybody here. Okay, can everybody see what we're looking at here? Thumbs up. Excellent. Okay, so the purpose of this graphic is to give us the context that Augustine is not going to give us, because remember, this is not strict autobiography. It's fairly impressionistic. He can presuppose his original audience knows where the stories are coming from, but we're not going to know this because none of us had this sort of education. So I just want to walk us through this graphic so we get an idea of what's going on in books 1, book 2, and book 3. Well, we know that Augustine's education began in his hometown of Tagaste when he was about 7 years old. This program would have been really just the basics: reading, writing, practical math. And if you're wondering what practical math meant in this context, it's basically how much math do you need to run a farm? And that's pretty much what they got. So that's happening at this stage. So this is referred to as the literator, or the primer magister. This is where Augustine begins his education. But at about age 12, he would have to progress and be sent to the grammaticus. This becomes doubly important for us because one of Augustine's first jobs is he himself becomes a grammaticus. But this is the second stage. In this stage, education is almost exclusively focused on literature. So while Augustine's first instructor, the primer magister, would have been a generalist and typically a person of no real reputation, actually these early teachers were sometimes kind of broke and failed men. The grammaticus, on the other hand, was actually a subject matter expert. This was a much more distinguished position. Well, there was no grammaticus in Tagaste. So Augustine was sent to Madoris, which was about 25 miles to the south. I'll show this to you on a map a little bit later in the presentation. But this just helps us to frame in what's going on books 1, 2, and 3. Most of Augustine's really vivid images about his school days are coming from here. Obviously, he wasn't reading Fitzgerald's translation of the Aeneid because he had it in Latin, but this is the text that he would have memorized as a child. And at the same time, if you think back to some of the anecdotes in book 1, he relates the story about Terence's eunuch with its portrayal of Zeus tricking a woman into adultery, which is, of course, Zeus's MO throughout all of classical mythology. Augustine critiques this. Augustine also talks about giving a prize-winning recitation from the Aeneid, so he has to get into character. This was called an ethopoeia. This is actually a formal Latin exercise that schoolboys did. So he had to pretend to be Juno, and he had to take Virgil's poetry and turn it into prose and deliver it in a way that his classmates and the judges would find compelling. He won first prize. He talks about this. That's happening here. But in book 2, which is where we're at, Augustine's studies are interrupted. So he has to leave Maduros. He has to leave the Grammaticus and come back home to Tagaste, where he's forced to return while his father Patricius raises funds for the final stage of his education. This is going to happen with the rhetor, which is the professional rhetorician, is training people for law, really for formal government posts in the Roman Empire. Augustine's going to have to go much, much further away, about 250 kilometers to Carthage to get this education. This is where we find ourselves in book 3. So let me stop sharing the graphic. Okay, so this helps us get a sense of what a classical education looked like, what's happening in books 1, 2, and 3. Augustine does make the remark about Patricius raising funds for him. And on the subject of Patricius, his father, it's in book 2 of Confessions that we encounter the only description that Augustine really will ever supply about his father. In 5.1 million words, 130 books, this is pretty much the only place he says much of anything. Augustine's remark about his father's financial supererogation to get him to the school of the rhetor in Carthage is about the only positive comment that Augustine will make. And even this is not really overwhelmingly positive if you read it closely. Augustine in book 2 is going to reflect on the essentially unspiritual attitude of his father that contributed nothing really to guiding him spiritually, and nothing that contributed to protecting Augustine's own burgeoning sexuality as an adolescent. So Patricius is for Augustine really the model of the purely natural man. The onset of puberty with all of its disordered affections and all of Augustine's reflections on this occupy the first half of book 2, which is what we're heading into right now. In the second half of book 2, we encounter the pear tree incident, which seems like this should be rather innocuous, but for Augustine, it's actually infused with an enormous amount of meaning. And why? What's the deal with this childhood prank? Well, it's because he's carefully considering the role of motive and the problem of gratuitous evil. And really, he's raising the question, is there any such thing as doing something evil for the sake of evil? For Augustine, early behaviors can easily become permanent character traits. And Confessions does actually reflect a compounding effect of sin at each successive stage of life. And we'll see an example of this when we get towards the end of the book 3. But as a guiding symbol in Confessions, the pear tree is the first of 2 symbolic trees in the first 9 books. The second tree we're going to encounter in book 8. This is a fig tree, which has lots of biblical resonance. Something very different, very dramatic is going to happen there as well. One scholar, I don't remember who, has made the remark that the Confessions can rightly be understood as the tale of 2 trees. We've got some kind of reenacting the fall at the pear tree and then the radical conversion at the fig tree. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the text of book 2. If you've got a copy of Bolding with you, it's fine to flip through this. I'll reference section numbers as I work through systematically. If you don't, that's fine. If you're happy to just listen and take this in, it's going to give you, I think, a really good grasp of what happened in books 2 and books 3. Okay, so book 2 naturally divides into 2 halves. And in the structural midpoint, there's a powerful quote that Augustine drops from the Psalms. And the quote that he makes is, "My iniquity burst forth from the fat," which is very picturesque. We'll come back to this in just a few minutes. The first half of book 2, as already remarked, is really just Augustine talking about his disordered sexual awakening. And on reflection, later in life, this is comprehensible to him because it has some lower good in view. Disordered affections for Augustine are either A, loving good things in the wrong way, or B, doing something evil to acquire a lower good. And this idea of lower goods and higher goods and the scale of good, we're going to get to this in a couple of minutes. But this is an important point. I feel the need to repeat this, is that Augustine understands this disordered sexual life and experience in this way, is that it did have a particular good in mind. It's a disordered approach to a good thing. But the second half is the pear tree incident. And for Augustine, the point that he's trying to make to us is that this is a gratuitous act of evil. And so he perceives this as actually worse than the sexual disorder he experienced as a 16-year-old, because there was no good. This was just evil for evil's sake. I mean, he's actually going to tease us with this idea: is there really such a thing as evil for evil's sake? But he's suggesting that there is. And then he's going to proceed to compare himself to Catiline. We'll talk about him in a second. Catiline becomes important for a number of reasons, but in context, the reason is that Catiline, who for the Roman at the end of late antiquity this is the model of evil. Like, this is the model of political sabotage and treason and murder and pillaging. I mean, this person's name is synonymous with everything evil from the perspective of Roman virtue. And Augustine's basically making the argument, what I did is actually worse than what Catiline did, because I just did evil for evil's sake. But when Catiline, who was a horrifyingly bad person, did evil things, he at least had something good in view that he was trying to get from it. So we have to reorient our thinking a little bit. And as we get into this a bit, and I show a couple more slides, I think this will become clearer. So happy with this so far. Great. Okay. So let's go ahead and jump to the prologue of book 2. So this would be 2:1 or 2:1 in the bolding edition, if this is the one that you're reading, and if not, of course, that's totally fine. So Augustine in book 2, an appropriate name for book 2 would really be 16-year-old Augustine. This is really what he's talking about. And so Augustine reflects on his 16-year-old disintegrated self. This is an Augustinian phrase. This is a theme that is going to recur throughout the Confessions, that life lived apart from God is disintegrated in the literal sense. It is dissolute. It is falling apart. It is seeking a multiplicity of things. Interestingly, he talks about the disintegrated self, but then he uses a term that we talked about before, which is he talks about God as holy sweetness. Do you remember this from last time? This was in the poem at 1:4. Augustine mentions God at the beginning of book 2 as holy sweetness. So this reappears, but now he's expanding it and explaining it a little bit. He says this, he says, out of love for loving you, I do this, making the confession, recalling my most wicked ways and thinking over the past with bitterness, so that you may grow ever sweeter to me. For you are a sweetness that deceives not, a sweetness blissful and serene. This is an important element of style in the Confessions of what Augustine does. So in book 1, we saw him take a phrase from the Psalms, but give it a new meaning, right? God is never addressed as sweetness in the Psalms. This is foreign to the thought of Scripture. It's not wrong, it's just not present there. Augustine takes this, now he applies it in a new way. And then when we get to book 2, he's expanded even further. He's playing with this idea and he's teasing it out in his confession. God as sweetness now means something more concrete. It's a sweetness. God is a sweetness that does not deceive. God is a sweetness that is blissful and serene. But for Augustine as a 16-year-old, that was not something that was to his flavor. Augustine abandons, he says, he abandons the unity that would come from this holy sweetness, and he pursues the multiplicity of his desires. Well, after the prologue, Augustine opens the first part of book 2 by describing his disordered affections at the onset of puberty, which most modern people read this and say, okay, this is just a description of normal puberty. Like, what's he on about here? One thing that he's on about is that when he's talking about this, Augustine is using highly picturesque language. And this is another element. This is, I think, what keeps drawing people back to the Confessions, and maybe is kind of the signature of Augustine's style, is his tendency to take these vivid images and find ways, interesting ways to link them and compound them. And so an example would be 2:2. Augustine talks about the bright boundary markers of friendship. That's a fairly unique phrase. And so he identifies this. He says, this is where I should have lived. I should have lived within the bright boundary markers of friendship. But, his words, the mud of my fleshly desires and my erupting puberty belched out murky clouds that obscured and darkened my heart until I could not distinguish the calm light of love from the fog of lust. Okay, there's one image. The two swirled about together, love and lust, and dragged me, young and weak as I was, over the cliffs of my desires and engulfed me in a whirlpool of sins. So you see what he's doing. He picks up an image, plays with it, and then immediately goes right into another image. There's almost kind of a verbal, improvisational kind of jazz thing going on, right? He picks up a theme, he tweaks it a little bit, and just keeps linking these over and over. Maybe you've picked up on this as you read it. It's what tends to keep the reader engaged. But then he lands somewhere in this section. He says, I was deafened. Here's another image. I was deafened by that clanking chain of my mortal state, which was the punishment for my soul's pride. I was deafened by that clanking chain of my mortal state, the punishment for my soul's pride. Well, this should trigger something for us. We've heard something like this before, because what Augustine is doing is he's recalling from book one that every disordered soul is its own punishment. This is another technique Augustine uses in the Confessions. He introduces a really interesting idea. A number of us picked up on this the last time. Every disordered soul is its own punishment. But now, what's he doing? He's taking this and he's giving it a new image. The idea that my mortality is a chain, and it's the noise that it makes is actually deafening me. Augustine concludes this section and says, you kept silence, and I continued to wander far from you. Let me share one other image with you here. Okay, so the image should begin evoking something for many or most of you. This is probably not a painting that you're familiar with, although it's a scene that you're almost certainly familiar with. This is a Russian artist, named Lusev. This is his depiction of the prodigal son. The Rembrandt version of the prodigal son is probably way more famous. I actually find this one quite a bit more interesting. Why do I show you this image? Well, because at the beginning of book two, and as we will see all throughout, Augustine keeps coming back to the image of the prodigal son. You kept silence, and I continued to wander far away from you. The prodigal son is something that I think it's fun to think of this kind of as an Easter egg and look for prodigal son Easter eggs, because Augustine's going to drop them all over the place in the first 9 books. I think I counted 3 or 4 in book 2. So then Augustine moves on from this, and he does something that's rather interesting, is that he records another missed opportunity to be healed by the sacraments. Let me explain what I mean by this. In book 1, as you might remember, at chapter 11, he raised the question, why was my baptism postponed? You might remember this. He was a small child. He got really sick. Monica was about to just pick him up and rush him to the baptistry because at this point he was unbaptized. Some of the theology of baptism was not entirely worked out yet in the 4th century. But his baptism was postponed. He recovered, and then the sense of urgency was gone. Monica didn't rush him to the baptistry. Augustine raises the question in book 1 of the Confessions of, why was my baptism postponed? What would life have looked like if I had entered into this experience of sacramental grace? It's one of those questions in the Confessions Augustine doesn't actually ever get answered. Now he asks a different question in book 2. He says, why is it that no one thought to arrange a marriage for me so that my pursuit of fleeting beauties through my ignoble experiences might be diverted into more useful channels? What Augustine's saying here is, well, here was another opportunity. In theory, I mean, this actually is a bit of a stretch. 16, 17, 18, theoretically, he could have been married. I mean, within the class he was in society, this could happen. It would be much more likely for a girl, less likely for a boy. But I think the point that Augustine's trying to make is, well, here I am again. There was the possibility of engaging with the sacrament and being channeled differently, but this wasn't realized for me. Well, when the family finances ran dry in book 2, as we'd already mentioned when we looked at the graphic, Augustine was forced to come home to Tagaste from nearby Maduros. And let's have a look here. Okay, this gives us a sense of Augustine's world. So Augustine's world as a child was centered in North Africa. So this would be modern day Algiers and Tunisia. Again, when Augustine's explaining this, in the Confessions, or rather when he's not explaining this, this sort of thing is not his concern. I mean, it's our concern because we want to have context and be able to place him. But Augustine's making a confession to God, and he's not really interested in chronology. He's not really interested in geography, but it does help us. So this is Augustine's world. I mean, basically this lane, I think it's Milan is getting cut off up here at the top because of the way that the screen works. But this would be where Augustine starts life, into Gaste, and Medorus is just right here about 25 miles to the south. This is where book 1 and 2 are taking place. When Augustine is sent to Carthage, that's over here, book 3, about 250 kilometers to the east. Eventually, Augustine is going to make his way to Rome, and then up to Milan, and then back to Rome, and then back to Tagaste, where he eventually becomes the bishop here in Hippo Regius. So Augustine's world was, in some sense, a fairly small place. He was only in Rome for a few years, and when he returned to North Africa, he never left again. But for our purposes, books 1 and 2 are here. Book 3 is happening here. So Augustine returns home from the Grammaticus and Medorus and has a year of leisure. The recollection of life back in Tagaste gives Augustine the opportunity to comment on his parents' motives as best as he remembers them. With respect to Patricius, Augustine can acknowledge that his father went well above and beyond what other more wealthy people would have done to secure Augustine's education. But he did so never with anything more than a this-worldly view of life. Augustine captures this completely by punning on the word desertus in Latin. This comes through pretty well in the Bolding translation, but basically desertus in Latin means like deserted, a desert. But desertus in Latin means educated or cultured. And so in this line in the Confessions, Augustine puns on this in reference to his father and says, my father Patricius was concerned that I was desertus, cultivated, educated. But the fact that I was a desertus, with reference to God, was of no concern of his whatsoever. If we were to pull this into English, we might say something like, Dad cared that I could write a dissertation. He didn't care that I was morally deserted. This is basically what Augustine's saying. Monica, by contrast, at the same time is urging on Augustine a chastity that cannot be provided for sacramentally in marriage. But in so doing, Augustine says something important, which is, we heard Augustine say, you were silent, I was wandering far from you. He's evoking the prodigal image. But when he starts talking about Monica's engagement with him, about his own sexual morality, he says a number of things which are interesting. One of them is, I would have been embarrassed to listen to my mom say these sorts of things, and I wasn't going to heed anything that she was saying. However, Augustine says, I realized these weren't the words of Monica. This was the word of God coming to me through my mother. And so the starkness of the contrast of Patricius, the purely natural man who is his father, and Monica, who early on in the story becomes the voice box of God to him, I think authentically, is very telling about how Augustine remembers the motives of his parents. So Augustine identifies this. He sees her words are the word of God to him. And then he uses this image that tends to confuse people. He invokes the idea of Babylon. Did you catch this in the reading? He says more or less, I was firmly embroiled, fixed in the center of Babylon, while my mother kind of lingered in the suburbs. People encounter this and think, okay, that makes absolutely no sense. What's Augustine trying to say here? Well, Babylon was a really heavily loaded image in Augustine's mind and in the minds of other Christians in the 4th century. It has various resonances, biblical and historical. Babylon recalls the 70-year captivity of the Jews after the fall of Jerusalem. Babylon then in the book of Revelation is kind of presented as the capital of and synonymous with pagan Rome and the world of sin. So then it becomes the opposite of the heavenly Jerusalem. And Babylon for Augustine becomes a source of confusion, a source of pride, lust for dominance over others, basically the human experience after the fall. So this is not, of course, a literal city, but when he's using Babylon to describe a spiritual state. Like I was in the center. My mom had largely actually made her way out, but she was still lingering in the suburbs. This is his very subtle way of saying she still was thinking, at times purely naturally and purely carnally about my well-being, and was not entirely spiritually guided in every decision that she was making for me. The interesting point on this, I think, is that when Augustine critiques Patricius, it's pretty unambiguous. But when Augustine critiques his mother, he resorts to this kind of abstract metaphor in order to locate where he remember her being spiritually. So that brings us to the end of the first half of book 2. Augustine ends this with the line that we mentioned before: my iniquity burst forth from the fat. Again, very picturesque, not a very pleasant image, but Augustine's description of these things in the first half of the book rely on a fair number of not very pleasant images to try to get the point across. So with the quote from the Psalms, there's then a quick pivot. Readers over the centuries have tended to miss the point and even expressed annoyance about Augustine making much ado about what seems like a harmless teenage prank. I mean, what's the point? Well, the point, as we said, is that Augustine is grappling with this idea of, at this point in time, when I experienced some kind of a fall, was I really just doing something evil for evil's sake? Is that really possible? Or when someone does something evil, do they always have to have something good in mind that they're pursuing? Augustine seems convinced at the beginning of this description that he didn't have anything good in mind. He just enjoyed evil for evil's sake. So Augustine uses this pear tree incident as an opportunity to teach us something about sin that most of us are probably not going to come up with on our own. And it's this: for Augustine, sin enters through the lowest goods in the hierarchy of good. And we'll explain this a little bit further in a second. Augustine does try to explain this at section 2.5. In 2.5, Augustine enumerates a number of things that we would consider representative goods of life. He talks about material objects being beautiful. He talks about power. He talks about friendship. There's a triad here. And he emphasizes something. He emphasizes that sin can only enter in through these lower goods. And so Augustine is starting to teach us, he's starting to introduce this distinction between the higher goods of life and the lower goods of life. Logically, the higher goods cannot harm us. The higher goods cannot induce us to sin, and sin is never required to obtain them. God, of course, in this hierarchy stands at the very top. God is the greatest good. Augustine would say God cannot actually do us any harm. Augustine has actually already kind of said this in the prologue. So this becomes a very important point in Augustine's outlook, is he sees the world in a hierarchy of goods, and the greatest goods, God himself, and then the virtues, theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, natural virtues, justice, prudence, temperance. Augustine will look at all these things and say, the higher goods never lead you to sin. And people don't sin to get the higher goods. People don't sin in order to be prudent. People don't sin in order to be just. People don't sin in any imaginable way in order to obtain to the vision of God. It's through the lower goods. These are the things that people get messed up on. So Catiline then, by contrast, Augustine brings him into the picture. Though immensely wicked, Augustine wants to illustrate, although this is the case, he was never actually gratuitous with his evil, meaning he had a point. When Catiline did something evil, it was always a means to an end. This end was limited to the lowest goods. So this is part of the point that Augustine's making about Catiline. Catiline's vision of the world and of life was just to obtain the lowest goods, and he was willing to do evil things to get those. So in Augustine's boyhood prank of stealing a neighbor's pears and feeding them to the pigs, which there's another resonance of the prodigal son, Augustine develops this whole question of motives. The Catiline Conspiracy of Sallust is a book that he would have read probably in Madoros, and something that he would have encountered when he studied Cicero as well. Got one more graphic to show on this. This is you're into paintings of classical scenes. This is a somewhat famous painting called Cicero Denouncing Catiline. And so here's Cicero, who probably of all Latin authors exercised the greatest influence over Augustine's formation and intellectual development. Here's the whole Senate conspicuously on one side, and here's Catiline sitting there looking like he's, wants to murder everybody in the room, which is of course exactly what he wanted. So this is an image. Of course, Augustine wouldn't have seen this image, but in terms of the literature that Augustine encountered, this image of Cicero denouncing Catiline and everything that Catiline represented to Roman sensibility would have been very present to Augustine and very present to his original readers. Okay, so Augustine develops this idea about the hierarchy of goods in another direction in Book 2 that I feel like we need to pay attention to, because for Augustine, vice, that is, well, we'll talk about what he thinks vice is. Vice is not something on its own. This is not how most modern people think about vice, but vice is not a thing on its own. In Augustine's mind, vice is actually a defective virtue. And this fits in very neatly with Augustine's whole definition of evil, which we'll encounter in just a minute when we get to Book 3. But for Augustine, he thinks about things in terms of the hierarchy of the good, but he also thinks in terms of things as vices and virtues, but vices in a way that is not really how modern people think about it, which has nothing to do with its accuracy. And let's have a look at this. I'll show you what I mean. Okay. So in 2:7, it's not obvious, kind of on a first or second or third reading, what Augustine is doing here with this whole issue of vices as counterfeit virtues. And scholars have picked up on this section, both French and English scholars have looked at this and said, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. And if you go through with a pencil, pay attention to what's happening, it does become obvious on repeat readings what Augustine's doing here in this section. He's going through and he's identifying all of the vices, right? But he's saying this is really what it is. These are defective imitations of something good. Pride imitates loftiness. Now, I've left off the tagline of all of these, which there's a formula, and he says this like 12 or 13 times in this section. He'll say, well, pride imitates loftiness, but what is more loftier than you, O Lord? Remember, of course, this is a confession he's making directly to God. Ambition imitates eternal glory, but who possesses eternal glory more than you, O Lord? Cruelty wants to extract from people reverential fear, but who is more worthy to be feared than you? I'm not going to go through all these. You get the sense of where this is going. But if you happen to go back and read this section, it does become fairly transparent what he's doing here. There is a list. There is actually some sense of hierarchy to this. But the point that he wants to make to us is that you're probably not thinking about the higher and lower goods exactly the right way. So let me use an absurd example to try to get your attention on this. And that's what Augustine's doing. Likewise here, what he's saying is you all probably tend to think about the vices as something, but what I'm trying to explain to you is that they're not. They're just a defective imitation of the thing that people really want, and they really want this because this is who God is. He is lofty. He possesses eternal glory. He ought to be feared. He ought to be adored. He is complete simplicity and innocence. This is what people want. But the vices are the wrong way to try to imitate this. And what we need to find is the right way to imitate this. So Augustine's final reflection on this whole pear tree incident, and he's weaved some really heady stuff into this, but his final reflection on the pear tree incident is this: I don't think I would have done it if I was alone. This is more or less verbatim what he says. He said, I would not have stolen alone. That wouldn't have made any sense to me. So it seems like when we get to the end of this, the end of Book 2, Augustine's conceding something in 2:8 and 2:9. And what he's conceding is that there was something there, that maybe nobody can really just do evil for evil's sake. And the something that was in it for him was the thrill of conspiracy. A lot of attention is given to this section because it seems to be the earliest description of peer pressure and being ashamed not to go along with the group. And that, of course, is exactly what it is. Augustine would not have thought of it in those terms necessarily, but maybe he was actually inspired here by the example of Catiline, because he realizes that the thrill of conspiracy is actually a lower good. There's something to this. Maybe that's what he was after. So Augustine ends the description of his 16th year, at the end of book 2, in the terms of the prodigal son. But true to form with Augustine, this ends up being a powerful reworking of the image of the prodigal, because he doesn't say, I wandered farther away from you. He doesn't say, I fed the pigs. He's already kind of said these things. He doesn't say, I became the prodigal. What does he say? He says, I became a land of famine. This is still the imagery. This is still the painting of the prodigal, but it's a different reading of it. And he does this, and he does this brilliantly. And so this works on a couple of levels, because there's the prodigal theme again, but it also ties back into other imagery that he's used in book 2. There's no time to capture everything that he said, but earlier in the book, he talked about his life was like sowing sterile seeds. Well, this is an agricultural image. He talks about being a desert with reference to God, that God is the owner of the field, which is his heart. These are all agrarian, these are all agricultural images. And he lands on an agricultural image that he draws from the prodigal son. I became a land of famine. How's everybody doing so far? This is pretty dense stuff. These are short books, but there is a lot going on in these. So we'll catch our breath for a second here and jump into book 3. And yes, guess what? I have another visual. I came to Carthage, says Augustine. This is obviously computer generated, but in a moment you'll see why this is actually remarkably accurate. So this gives you some sense of the harbor of Carthage. This is a place Augustine no doubt would have walked and talked with friends. The challenge sometimes with these computer generated images is we think, well, how realistic is that? How do we know that Carthage looked anything like that? Well, the reason we have an idea it looked like that is because it looked like that. This is another computer enhanced image of what the ancient harbor would have looked like. This is the harbor like last year in Tunisia, where the archaeological park is for Carthage. So the basic structure of the harbor is still intact there. We don't have time to really dive into the archaeology of North Africa and all the work that's been done there, but if you nerd out on Augustine at some point, you won't run out of books to read about Roman archaeology in North Africa. But this does give us a picture of, okay, and if you were ever there, I've never been there, but if you were able to walk the archaeological parks, you would get a sense of, okay, we can have kind of a realistic image in some instances about what a place that's no longer there probably looked like. Okay, so Carthage. Augustine's actually making a joke when he starts book 3. It's difficult for it to come through in English, but it goes something like this. I came to Carthago, which is a Sartago. This is what's going on in Latin. I'm obviously mixing up the Latin and the English. I came to Carthago, which you know is a Sartago. Carthago, Carthage. Sartago is frying pan. This is what Augustine's saying. His original audience would have caught the joke. They would have, oh, right, this is wordplay. They would have recognized it immediately. Carthage is the skillet. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's supposed to give you a sense of the moral climate of the city. That's what's going on. Carthage is a skillet. Carthage is a frying pan. Carthage is a hotbed of immorality. The original audience hears Carthago, Sartago, they get the joke. Well, Carthage was the leading city of the province of North Africa. Augustine sent there when Patricius comes up with the money. He's about 17. Carthage is a wealthy and decadent city with a pretty vibrant history. This is the city of Hannibal, if you remember Rome's Punic Wars from Western civilization class. If you remember reading parts of the Aeneas, this is where the mythological Queen Dido is, or Aeneas shows up and then leaves her behind. So Augustine comes to Carthage, and he's going to tell us a couple things that we're going to work through here in rapid order. So he comes to Carthage, And one of the first impressions that he has is attending the theater. And this was the place that evidently he spent some time, and does form a rather interesting reflection, because the Roman people in general had resisted the permanent presence of theaters for centuries. I mean, they recognized this as something that did not enhance the moral fiber of the people of Rome, because they saw what it did, or what they perceived it did in Greece. But by Augustine's time, all scruples about this were long since abandoned. If you remember some of this from a classical history class or Western Civ, or did any work in theater, Aristotle had actually argued positively for the theater as a place where people go to experience catharsis. This is a word we hear. And no, it's a Greek word, comes from Aristotle. The theater was supposed to evoke this. On the other hand, on philosophical and moral grounds, Plato thought you should ban the theater and kick all the actors out of your ideal city, if you ever have one. But these Greek views of the theater are not really what's informing Augustine's reflection here. Augustine's reflection is actually a little bit more nuanced than the question of catharsis or the question of whether the theater corrupts people. Augustine looks at the theater and he says, well, here's the problem. The problem is this basically just manufactured an experience of false empathy, because I sat there and I would experience pity, which I actually enjoyed. There's a pleasure in this. And then if you read through this, you see he kind of grapples with the pleasure of pity. But there was this pleasure of pity. But the problem with this experience is it's never actually productive of compassion. And that's the whole point of the meditation, I think. Augustine says, I had these experiences. I could feel the feeling of falling in love. I could feel the feeling of losing a lover. I enjoyed the pain of that. I enjoyed feeling that pity. But as an audience member, I could never actually have compassion on anyone. And so he sees this as really, in some sense, a vice, because it doesn't fructify into love, it doesn't turn into anything useful. And he's really kind of panning from scene to scene of life in Carthage. So, okay, there's the theater. Well, what's next, Augustine? He says, well, the other thing that happened is while I was in Carthage, I fell in with this group called the Wreckers. And people ask, well, what's going on with this? Who are the Wreckers? What's the point? Well, the Wreckers were kind of this snobbish gang of upperclassmen that harassed the younger students and were generally just disturbers of the peace. But I think there's actually something more interesting going on here. I think with the Wreckers, this group that Augustine kind of identifies with, it's actually an interesting prefigurement of the Manichees, who are right around the corner. Consider this. When Augustine talks about the Wreckers, he describes himself as being on the fringe. Like I kind of hang out with these guys, but I don't really go along with everything that they do. I'm not in the inner circle. While in the company of both the Wreckers and the Manichees, we'll see this later, Augustine reads a book, and he reads a book that sets him apart from the group and puts him on another trajectory. Here it's going to be the Hortensius. Later in Confessions, it's going to be the books of the Neoplatonists. He sees both groups, the Wreckers and the Manichees, as demonically motivated, but the Manichees at a whole nother level. The season that he spends with the Wreckers in Carthage is kind of a microcosm of what's going to happen later with the Manichees. Augustine's on the fringe. Augustine's going to harass Catholics who have not been very well catechized, while Augustine hangs out with Manichees. Augustine has a significant encounter with a book that dislodges him and advances him. But remember, at each stage, sin gets worse. I think this is what's going on in the Confessions. The pear tree incident, it all seems rather tame, right? Right. But then the Wreckers is another level of degradation, because the pear tree incident is kind of just kids being kids. But the Wreckers are actually enjoying inflicting harm on other people. And then the Manichees is a whole nother level, because this is a group that Augustine is now a part of that is basically a counter church to the Catholic Church and is actively trying to draw people out of the Catholic Church. And Augustine correctly identifies that there's no reasonable hope of salvation with these people. And so you see this kind of tiering effect that when Augustine's choosing these memories, they're not entirely arbitrary. I mentioned Cicero's Hortensius. I do want to say a word on this as we kind of turn the corner towards the end of book 3 here. Cicero's Hortensius, for like 500 years, this book's lost. We don't have it. But for 500 years, scholars have been trying to figure out how to reconstruct Cicero's exhortation to the philosophical life. That's what the Hortensius was. It was one of Cicero's dialogues Augustine read. The design of it was to try to inspire people to pursue a philosophical life. And Cicero had a very definite idea of what that looked like. I actually found this idea so interesting that when I was in Oxford, I threw my hat into the ring, and my dissertation was on how to reconstruct the Hortensius from the fragments. So this is a work I know really, really well. As you can imagine, when you have that skill, the job offers are just like rolling in when you know how to reconstruct the Hortensius, which really nobody does, but we have some ideas on it. Most of this is lost, but we do know something important that Augustine tells us. In the Hortensius, at the end, Cicero stands up and gives a big speech to his friends. And this speech starts out with a definite saying. And the saying in English is, surely everybody wants to be happy. And I'll say it again. Cicero starts the big speech. He says, surely everyone wants to be happy. This is the most frequently cited fragment from the Hortensius, and Augustine is actually already cited this in book 3 once. You might have missed it. But at the beginning of the discussion about tragic theater, he says this, surely everybody wants to be happy. So tragic pity kind of doesn't make any sense. Well, Augustine's going to quote this little line from the Hortensius for the next 50 years. There's probably at least 20, 25 instances of it that we found where Augustine uses these words, surely everybody wants to be happy. This becomes a philosophical certainty for him, which is of great interest, but we can't go there right now. The problem for Augustine with the Hortensius, as life-changing as it was, his representation is, this is great, but it's missing something. Did you catch what it's missing? So the Hortensius is great, but it's missing the name of Christ. So I couldn't really go all in on it. It got me part way. And this does give us a little glimpse into Augustine's formation for Monica. There was something that he took in that became a litmus test. If the name of Christ isn't there, I know this isn't going to get me to the destination I want to get to. So the effect, though, on Augustine from reading the Hortensius is he does something that he doesn't report doing prior to this, which is he actually picks up the Bible and tries to read it himself. So he picks it up in a very bad translation and is massively disappointed and says, this is not going to work for me. I'm used to Cicero. It's very elegant. It's very pure. The Latin of this kind of translation-y Bible that I have is kind of a stopper for me. And so he's disappointed. He sets it down. He was not the only person who felt this way. Jerome, when he picked up the old Latin Bible, felt the same way, but Pope Damasus asked him to do something about it, which was produce the Vulgate. And so Jerome's life work was to actually rectify the situation that Augustine and Jerome felt, which is when you come to some of these translations of the Bible, they're really, really badly done. They're kind of getting in the way. So Augustine says, Hortensius, great, kind of separates me from the wreckers. The name of Christ isn't there. I'm going to look at the Bible. Kind of disappointing. Maybe someone else has the answer. Just give us details. But he says, and then I fell in with the Manichees, which was it a friend? Was it a teacher? We don't know. I mean, this is part of the confession. We don't know who he met that got him tangled up in this. But the Manichees had a three-pronged attack for the not very well-educated Catholic. And Augustine tells us what they would say. They would show up and say, well, you can't solve the problem of evil, can you? And at this point, Augustine says, no. And they would say, well, in the Old Testament, doesn't it kind of seem like God has a body? He has a strong right arm, and you have these theophanies of God appearing. Is that what's going on? Does God have a body? Augustine said, I guess I don't know. And further, they would say, well, what about the patriarchs? It seems like some of them really behaved badly, and yet these are your Old Testament saints. Doesn't this cause you like any discomfort? And Augustine says, this was massively disruptive for me. So Augustine testifies that when he encounters the Manichees, he's in a state of just terrific ignorance. And he repeats this in 3:7 over and over. I did not recognize, I did not know, I had no inkling, I had no idea. He said, there's three things I didn't know. It matches the questions. Augustine says, I didn't know that evil is a privation. I didn't know this. That wasn't the definition of evil I was working with then. I didn't know that God is a spirit. I always thought of God as something bodily. So what the Manichees kind of made sense. And I didn't understand that righteousness is different than custom. So he reports these things, and unwinding these is going to occupy the next couple books. So let me just jump to the end here to leave a couple minutes for questions. Augustine does conclude this introduction of the Manichees by referencing one of their rather bizarre beliefs and rituals about eating and thinking that they're burping out God. There's quite a bit to this, actually. But what Augustine's reporting is a fairly accurate reading of Manichae belief. They felt like they were releasing the particles of God that were trapped in material things, and that this group called the elect, kind of this upper class Manichae, were the kind of a priestly class who had the power to do this. Augustine and his friends would take them food to release the particles of God. This is what we're dealing with. So he concludes with that story, and that sets up the proper ending for book 3, which is Monica. It ends with Monica because her reaction to this is basically, I don't think I want you in the house anymore. And I don't really think we can sit down and have a meal together if this is who you've aligned yourself with, because she's savvy enough to recognize the problem with the Manichees. So she has a dream. There's a ruler. She's standing on it. A cheerful young man shows up and says to her, hey, look, at some point in time, Augustine's going to be standing next to you on this ruler. So this raises the question, well, who is this cheerful young man that shows up in the vision? Most scholars that read this think, well, this is a picture of Christ. Why? Because Augustine makes the comment, he says, the cheerful young man posed a question to my mom, and he says his question was intended to teach her, not to elicit information for himself. Well, who does that? This is the modus operandi of Christ in the Gospels. He asks people questions to elicit responses, not because he needs to be informed, but because he's trying to teach them something. This is basic to how Christ teaches. So that's probably what's going on there. And then the final scene that closes out book 3, a rather famous scene, of course, is Monica has the vision. She finds some comfort in this. I mean, she's still distraught, but this does give her an anchor of hope. But then she appeals to an unnamed, importantly, Catholic priest slash bishop, who apparently was known for being able to recover the wayward. She goes to him and says, hey, well, you got to talk to my son. You're the guy that can fix this. And he says, no, I don't think so. He said, I know the problem here, and this is something that's going to have to work itself out on its own time, because Augustine's smart enough to figure out what's going on. She said, well, how do you know this? And he says, well, because I was a Manichae, because my mom, when I was 7, was really foolish, and she handed me over to them, and I copied the books out for 10, 15 years. I know everything the Manichees believe. I know where Augustine's at. Talking to him right now is not going to do him any good. And so Monica really doesn't accept this, and like petitions. It's an interesting word that Augustine coins here. It's called substomachor. It means he's mildly agitated, not like full on angry, but just kind of mildly agitated. He's like, look, literally he says, look, woman, I don't have more time to talk about this. No son of this many tears could possibly perish. And this becomes the quintessential line that defines the relationship of Monica and Augustine. So I'll pause there. I mean, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes longer if others wish to, but if there are questions, I'm happy to take those now.
Hey, Kevin, this is great. I know Madonna put out a little chat that says if anyone has a question, just put it in the chat, or just take yourself off mute. You can ask it. We can figure it out. But first of all, thank you. As I read and then as I listened to your commentary, at least for me, I thought the major themes that jumped out was in Augustine's portrayal of his dad and his mom. It was really, I think you made this clear, sort of a clear image of temporal versus eternal, if you will, and where he netted out on that. And then I thought also in the pear tree incident, he indirectly but appropriately characterized sin simply as the absence of goodness, right? Sin is what happens when there's nothing else there. Evil is what happens when there's nothing else there. And then as we transition now from book 3 to book 4, the ball on the tee is we all want to be happy, how do we get there? And Manichaeism is not the correct path, and here's why. And he'll get us to the correct path in the next books. So those are kind of my major takeaways. But thought I would just tee it up to like, what other, if there are any other takeaways that you have that you would leave us with tonight, and then I think we have a couple other questions that just popped up.
Well, yeah, for all that, it's a really dense, 2 and 3 are really dense in terms of the Augustinian vision of reality that he's working out. So there's always the storytelling of what's going on. Augustine is the 16-year-old, but then Augustine the bishop who's giving the commentary and giving the explanation of it. I would say for all that, though, I think the ending is significant. The fact that it ends on Monica, it does portend where Confessions is actually going here. And it does suggest what others have picked up on, which is the unbelievable influence that she had as a Catholic mother on him. That at this early stage, he's talking about all of these things that are going on in his life. We do get the vibe of how he feels towards Patricius, but it's important how things end. And book 3 ends with Monica being portrayed the way she's going to be portrayed in a much more amplified way in book 9, which is effectively she's the voice of God to him at this stage of his life. He can't read the Bible for his own and make sense of it, but when she speaks into his life, he says, "This is the voice of God," and this is only going to continue to be the pattern. And then in book 9, he's going to spend most of the book telling her story. So I think really the centrality of Monica as a character is what I'm struck with on the rereading of book 3, that he ends with her.
We have a question, Kevin. In section 9, he writes, "And there are some actions again that are very much like sins and yet are not sins. What are these actions?"
Yeah, I'll have to pick that back up and take a look. I think this is the section where Augustine is talking about people making progress in virtue. And so the sense of this, and admittedly, this is a section I skimmed over and preparing the notes for this. But when he talks about things being very much like sins and yet are not sins, I think he's talking about the spiritual development of the believer. And that this may be kind of sort of talking about like venial sins, but certainly not the catastrophic, I guess, mortal sin that he would have viewed himself as having been entangled with the Manichees. That does actually inspire me to go back and read that a little bit more closely, though.
Thank you, Kevin. There are no other questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, well then, it is right at the top of the hour, and so I want to once again thank Kevin for your time preparing and leading this discussion. I want to thank Madonna and Sarah for the production of this event, if you will, and certainly making it known to all of us. Would like to encourage everyone to keep reading along, and please come back. We'll be here again in a month. And if you have feedback in between now and then, please send it to me. And we will try and incorporate that feedback into future events. And for those of you who happen to be rooting for the Augustinian University playing in the Big East tournament, let's wish them luck as well. And I wish you all a peaceful night. God bless you, and thank you for joining. Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, Kevin. It's fabulous.